dans les autres connaître qu'il y a un ton, c'est en Missouri qui parlait français, c'est. Mais si tu parles anglais, parce que les Anglais, c'est dans l'autre côté du fleuve de Mississippi. So, yeah, what he said. Yeah, il y a vu son ton, le français qui on parle ici, en Missouri, ça sonne comme ça. Parce qu'ici, on parle avec un accent qui est très bon, c'est comme la Louisiane, dans la sud. C'est dans le Québec, je dis non. Parce qu'il y a un petit mélange. We actually have a French here in Missouri that's somewhere between Louisiana and Quebec. Because we're somewhere between Louisiana and Quebec. Basically. And it's an interesting story of how the French came to. And I'm probably not going to bore you with talking about all of that. I'm going to wait till the history class tomorrow to bore you with how the French all came here, for those of you the history students. So I just want to talk a little bit more about some of the background of the area and some of the music that is in this area. And ouais, je suis une personne qui moi je suis fier de parler français. Ici, moi je parle français comme une personne qui vient du pays Illinois. Ici, I speak French like somebody from the Illinois country, essentially, because I'm from the Illinois country. And by the way, you all probably didn't know this. I learned this too about 24 years ago. You're actually in Illinois right now. I know when you drive around, you see the Missouri state signs, but you're in Illinois. Nobody's throwing anything. This is good. I've done a lot of programs in Missouri, and I've had people throw things at me when I say that. So actually, the French language and music in this part of the country has been here for a very long time. As the professor said, it's interesting because when you think about the United States, well, the United States of American history that applies in your books, for the most part, can apply if you were born and raised east of the Mississippi River. But when you get west of the Mississippi River, boy, it gets really cloudy with that. And, well, where I was born and raised on the Wabash. Wabash, everybody spells that W-A-B-A-S-H. But it was originally spelled O-U-B-A-C-H-E. The Wabash. Wabash, it's actually an Indian term from the Potawatomi. And actually taken by the French to denote the Wabash River. And what's interesting about that is that the rivers have always been the roads for the French in this part of the country. And so the rivers have always been very important. I was fortunate to be raised only about 45 minutes from Vincennes, Indiana. And I've always was interested in the French culture in our area, such as it was. We had a sheriff growing up with the last name Boyer, as everybody said the name Boyer. Of course, that's Bouillet. And I had good friends as growing up that were Lavellets and Lovitts. Lavellets and Lovitts, also known as La Violette and Levesque. Of course. And growing up near Vincennes, I used to how I ended up spending a lot of time in Vincennes is because they had a shoe cobbler there that made shoes. And me, I had really big feet, so we went there a lot, and I'd have boots made for me. And it always interested me how there were these beautiful, just a few of them left, but French Creole homes in Vincennes, and hardly anybody ever spoke about them. But there were events in town, like the Rendezvous that they had, sort of a restart. They even had some events in the 1970s that they called the 12th Night Balls. They existed for a few years and then they went away, and I didn't know what they were for. Didn't have any reason. I knew there were these French homes in Vincennes, but what's the point? Because from what I had been told, growing up over in southeastern Illinois, just across the river, is that Vincennes was a very, very German town. But I was like, wow, that's a real interesting name, Vincennes, because I'd heard there's French there, there's these French homes. And I'd be standing in line at the grocery store, because I'd basically heard, that there were no French left. I'd be standing in line in the grocery store, and you see in our area, a lot of family farms, and they put their name of the family farm on the back of their jacket. And I'd be standing in line with people named like Cardinal, Cardinal. And I said, man, Cardinal, that's a really cool name. Never heard that one before. Must be a German name. You see names like Bourasol. I'd see, it's like Burasiel, like that. You say, look at Burasiel. I said, dang, that's another really good German name too. You know, and I was like, wow, there's so many Germans here. You know, it's amazing. And I was always surprised by that. In fact, I was wondering because I had always heard these stories about George Rogers Clark. We knew there's the National Memorial to George Rogers Clark in Vincennes. And I'd go there, and I was always amazed by the fact that they always talk about George Rogers Clark and the Americans coming in and taking Vincennes, and they took it from the British. And of course, there were all these British, you know, I assumed all these British people living in Vincennes at the time. And they'd make some mention, though, when you go in the museum about there being a few French people kind of around, you know, maybe hiding in caves and things like that, you know. And I was always wondered about that. I was like, where are these French, you know, that they're talking about? So I actually talked to somebody one day at the Vincennes State Historic Site. I was about 12 years old, 12 or 13, and this was a long time ago. And so I walked up to him, and you know, I was asking him about the French, and he says, yes, Vincennes was a French place. And I said, well, where are all the French in Vincennes? He says, if you go to the cemetery, he said, you can find lots of French. And lots of French people in the cemetery. And I was like, well, that's interesting. But are there any French people? Oh, no, not really. Well, this left in my mind for years. What happened to the French? And somehow, at some point, my dad, who was a great history buff, said, we need to go over to southwestern Illinois, this little community of Prairie de Roche, Illinois. And I remember going there and actually meeting a gentleman over there, one person by the name of Percy Clerk in the 1980s, who spoke a little French, spoke just a little bit, and he sang a song that I thought was just an amazing tune. I didn't really learn it then, but when I would hear it later, I knew exactly what I heard. In Prairie de Roche, Illinois, some people just call it Prairie, some people call it La Roche, some people call it Prairie Rocher. You know, because it's not that far from Bucket Creek, you know, just up from Versailles, you know, in southern Illinois, just kind of like Missouri. We got the names too. So, but I heard this song.
Bonsoir la maîtresse, ça y est, elle est bonne de l'eau vin. Pour la dernière, je la mets, c'était la graine de bébé. Si vous voulez nous donner des têtes, si vous voulez nous donner des têtes, on fait le monde sur le monde à déchiner. Un déchiner n'est pas grand-chose, à dire 90 pieds de long. Un déchiner n'est pas grand-chose, à dire 90 pieds de long. Chauffer le pied, on lui verra faire bon le chien, on lui verra chauffer le pied.
I said, what was that song? And he was talking about it. It was at a place called Fort des Chartres, which you all should visit sometime south of St. Louis on the Illinois side. Actually contains in the fort there the oldest known standing building in the state of Illinois, actually built in the middle 1700s. Of course, it's not a huge thing that's going to really excite you. It's a powder magazine. That's the oldest standing building in the state of Illinois. But I asked this gentleman, I said, so what's that name of that song? And they called it the Guione. They called it the Guione. It didn't mean anything to me. I didn't even see what it was called. So some years later, I didn't get a chance to go back and see the gentleman anymore. But what happened was essentially a few years later, 1990, I go to school at Southeast Missouri State University in Cape Girardeau. And I had been to St. Genevieve at this point, spent a lot of time in St. Gen wandering around the homes. And I thought St. Genevieve was such a beautiful place. And it is, and I'm not saying past tense, it is beautiful. But it depressed me at the same time. Because by the time I started going to St. Genevieve, Mr. Leclerc, or Claire, as some people say, had died in a house fire. And I was like, well, so much for the French language. What few minutes of it I heard, I was like, well, that's all gone. So I got talking with a professor, Dr. Frank Nickel, down at Southeast Missouri State, and we were talking about the architecture of St. Genevieve and the Pierre Menard home in Cahokia, Illinois, and Florissant, Missouri, which has some really cool French Creole homes. And I was like, these are all really cool places, but you know, it's depressing that here there were these thousands of French Creoles that lived in Illinois, and Indiana, and Missouri, and the fact that their language is just completely gone. Done. Out of here. You know, was the Anglo horde that big that it came in and just completely wiped out, you know, the French? And of course he laughed at me and he says, I don't know what you're talking about, Dennis. He says the French language is still alive in Missouri. He said it might be gone in Indiana and southern Illinois, but it's still alive in Missouri. And I was like, why? And he said, well, because of the party line phone system. Now that's not going to mean a lot to some of you in here. It actually means something to me because I'm old enough that I can remember growing up in the countryside in southeastern Illinois. My grandparents were on a circuit. You would have sometimes 5 to 8 phone lines out in the country in which everybody was on the same circuit, and you knew to pick up your phone by the number of rings that you had. But the thing about it was everybody else could hear your conversation on that circuit. Yeah, kind of like the old Jot 'em Down store radio shows, you know. It's true. And so I asked him, I said, how is this working, you know, party line phone system? He says, well, because, he said, what I've heard, he said, is that in the area known as the Old Mines, Missouri, he said, south of St. Louis, near DeSoto, north of Potosi, that the older people in the area there are French. They're French Creoles. They're some of the same people that were in St. Genevieve and Vincennes and Prairie du Roche, and that they speak French today because of the party line phone system. And I said, well, how? He said, because they didn't teach the younger people, and the older people keep the language alive to keep the young kids out of their conversation. He said, because they can't understand it. And I was like, well, that's interesting. So I waited 2 days, and I was off hitting the road, hitting the trail to go to old mines, started stopping at different places along the way. And stopped at a gas station in Potosi and asked some people there, guy there, are you French? I told him I was from Southeast Missouri State. I was a student. I was looking for the French. And he's like, yeah, I'm French. My parents speak French too. And I was like, yeah. I had like one class in community college of French. I got a C in it. Because I didn't like French. I thought it was boring, to be honest with you. And not only that, and I loved her to death, and she was great, and remained a good friend for years. But my French teacher was from like Alabama, and so when she spoke French, she spoke with a southern accent, a really southern accent. And so bonjour, y'all. So anyway, so I was like, you know, I didn't know if I could even have conversation with anybody. So the guy sent me farther north into the city, into the big hub of Old Mines itself, which is to population 80, you know. And so I go into the gas station, convenience store, post office, laundromat in Old Mines. And I asked, there was a lady in there working, I told her who I was and where I was from, and I asked her if she spoke French, and if she was French, and she's like, yeah, I'm French. She said, everybody around here is French. And she said, well, where are you from? And I told her where I was from, and I said, well, do you speak French? And she said, yeah, I speak French. And I said, oh, great. I said, would you mind saying something to me? I said, I took French in community college, and I said, I think I can understand a little bit. She goes, oh, you took school French, huh? And I said, yeah. And she goes, no, I'm not going to speak French to you because you don't speak real French. I was confused. I said, what do you mean I don't speak real French? She said, well, that's not real French. She said, that's stuff people do in school. But she said, that's not actually how people talk. You know, I was so confused by that, because I remember watching all these videos about people in France and how they spoke, and I was like, no, there's this whole population out there. And she said, no, I'm not going to talk French to you. She says, but if you go to the parish workers, the Catholic parish workers, and these are very important. I'll talk more about that in history class tomorrow. Go to the Catholic parish workers. So I went there, eventually found them. It took me 2 hours to go 7 miles, because I had only learned that week that routes in Missouri were in letters. And, well, in Illinois, we don't have that. So I got lost. Almost ended up in Rolla before I got back to Old Mines. But anyway, you know what I mean. So anyway, I went there and I found there was about 7 ladies sitting out on the porch. And, well, I walked up and said hi to them and told them who I was and what I was looking for, and asked if any of them knew anybody that spoke French. And 2 or 3 of the ladies said, oh, yeah, we all speak French. And I was like, great, here's my opportunity. So I said, I didn't even wait. I just said, bonjour, comment allez-vous? My best Southern Illinois French. They all started talking to me at the same time. I couldn't understand a word of what they were saying, but they invited me in. And so I said, hey, who are you people anyway? How is it that you speak French? These ladies were in their 70s and 80s. And I was just amazed that they spoke French. And I said, where are you from? You know, I was expecting to hear somebody say like Paris or Montreal or Belgium or something. And one lady's like, well, I'm from Richwoods. You know, I'm from Cadet, and I'm from Bonne Terre, and I'm from Old Mines. And I was like, but where are you from? Your history, where do you come from? And they're like, well, probably France. Probably. Maybe Quebec. Well, they invited me to go to bouillon parties. You ever heard of a bouillon? No, never been to a bouillon? If you've never been to a bouillon, you've never lived. Bouillon. How about in English? Bouillon. Bouillon cube. Yeah. If you take a bouillon cube, pop it into water, you get your soup. Well, with the French in Old Mines, Missouri, that's a party. It's Insta-party. Boom! Just like that. So I went to my very first party I went to, the very first house party, and they were playing French tunes. I got invited, went in there, and they were playing French songs, and I was like, this is so cool. And I tried to play, because I played a little bit of fiddle when I went. And I tried to get in the very first jam session, and they actually threw me out on the porch because I played so badly. And the only way they would let me back in is if I were to play spoons on a box. In fact, somebody took a picture of it that night 24 years ago, and it's been enshrined. Say, look, Dennis couldn't play. So, but one of the local fiddle players, and I didn't know anything, but one of the local fiddle players, a guy by the name of Roy Booyer, who I thought they said the name Booyer was interesting, because I was like, wait a second, my sheriff is spelled exactly the same way, and we say Boyer over in southeastern Illinois, but here they say Booyer. And I asked him, I was so confused by that, I said, Booyer. And I said, that's Boyer, right? He goes, not here. He said, we're Booyers. He said, but really it's Bouyer. And anyway, he was a barber, and he invited me to his shop, and the very first song he ever taught me to play was something called Red Wing, actually a very Anglo song, I thought. But he told me, now we play things a little bit differently here. And I eventually learned the Anglo version, and I'll do a little bit of the Anglo version for you. But then I'll show you the Old Mines French version. Good. It's all right. En français.